Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We're kicking off season 9, and this time we are really plunging into a fascinating world, the world of the Syriac early church fathers.
A great choice.
Yeah, these figures, they really were foundational in shaping so much of Christian theology, how we read and interpret the Bible even, and the practice of asceticism. And before we jump in, I just have to mention that the research for this whole season and for this deep dive specifically has been done by Andre Mubarak.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, he is a teacher and a tour guide based in Jerusalem. And he's an Aramaic-speaking Christian. He lives in Jerusalem. And his whole focus is really about teaching the Aramaic roots of the Christian faith. So important. Such an important perspective. If you want to find out more about his work, definitely check out his website, www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com.
I always find it so enriching to explore these traditions, especially ones that might not be as widely known as, say, their Greek or Latin counterpart.
Right.
But they're absolutely essential for understanding, the full tapestry of early Christian thought.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And in this particular deep dive, we're zeroing in on one of the giants in this tradition, Severus of Antioch.
Oh, a fascinating figure.
Yeah, we are going to unpack his life, his key theological ideas, and honestly, the lasting influence that he's had. Our mission, I think, is to understand why he continues to be such an important figure, especially for the Syriac Orthodox tradition.
Right.
We'll trace his journey from his early education, all the way to becoming this major voice in theology, his role in these huge Christological debates that were happening at the time, and the impact, the lasting impact of his writings and his leadership.
I'm excited to delve into it.
Me too. So let's start at the very beginning. Where and when does Severus' story begin?
Well, Severus was born, we believe, sometime between 459 and 465 A.D. in Caesapolis. It was a city in Pisidia, which is in the region of Asia Minor. He came from a prominent family, but even just trying to pin down his family's religious background gets a little complicated. The sources we have, they present different views.
Oh, real?
Yeah, some of the Miaphysite sources suggest his parents were actually pagan. But then later hagiographies, they try to link his family to a Christian bishop. So from the outset, we're dealing with this historical complexity.
Interesting. So even the very beginning of his story has these different interpretations already layered into it. But let's talk a little bit about his education. You mentioned he came from a prominent family. What kind of education would someone in his position at that time have received? Because he clearly became a very learned man.
Oh, absolutely. He would have received a thorough classical Greek education. This was standard for someone of his social standing. He studied grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy in Alexandria, which, as you know, is this major intellectual hub.
Right, a huge center of learning.
Exactly. And then he went on to study law at the famous law school in Beirut. This background in classical thought and this legal training, this precision in thinking, it would prove incredibly valuable in his later theological arguments.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Especially the rhetoric and the legal training that would equip him for that kind of detailed, very specific theological reasoning that he became known for.
Absolutely.
So how did this well-educated young man, someone who had all of these advantages, how did he end up on this path, becoming a key figure in the early church? What was that turning point?
Well, the pivotal moment, there's no question, was his conversion to Christianity in 488. He was still studying in Beirut at the time, and he was baptized at the shrine of St. Leontius in Tripolis, in Phoenicia. This event really marked a profound shift in his life's direction. He completely renounced his worldly ambitions and embraced a very ascetic, deeply religious life.
Wow, that is a major change in direction. He went from this path of law, potentially a very successful career, to this life of asceticism. What did that transition look like? What did he actually do?
Well, after his baptism, he fully dedicated himself to a very rigorous monastic life. At first, he joined a Miaphysite monastery near Mayuma, which is the port of Gaza, and he practiced extreme forms of asceticism there. There are accounts that he even refrained from bathing. So that gives you an idea of the level of dedication we're talking about.
Wow.
Later, he lived as a hermit for a while, really a solitary life. And he eventually helped establish a monastery near Gaza. And it was during these years in the monastery that his reputation for piety, for deep devotion, and also for his learning really started to grow.
So his time in the monastery was absolutely crucial in shaping him and his influence. But how did this reputation for holiness and for intellect, how did that propel him onto the wider theological stage?
Well, a crucial step was his ordination as a priest. He was ordained by Bishop Epiphanius of Magidos, who was in exile at the time.
Okay.
And this ordination really connected Severus directly to the anti-Chalcedonian or Miaphysite network. And by the early 500s, he had truly emerged as a leading theological voice among those Christians who did not accept the Council of Chalcedon. A really significant period for him was his time in Constantinople, 508 to 511. And he was right there in the heart of the empire advocating for the Miaphysite cause. He even gained the confidence of Emperor Anastasius I, who, as we know, was sympathetic to those who rejected the Chalcedonian decrees.
Right. So Constantinople was the center of power politically and also for the church. Gaining that imperial support must have been a huge boost for the Miaphysite movement.
Oh, without a doubt. It gave him a platform, a level of influence that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And it's interesting because he initially actually opposed Emperor Zeno's Henoticon, which was meant to be this kind of unifying document.
Right, to try to bridge the divide.
Exactly. But under Anastasius, he accepted it as a kind of compromise. And he shifted his focus to really refuting both Nestorian and extreme Monophysite teachings, so addressing the errors of people like Eutyches and the Massalians. And during these years in Constantinople, his reputation for his deep learning, for his genuine holiness, it really solidified, especially among the Christians in Syria and Egypt.
So by the time he becomes the Patriarch of Antioch, he's already a very well-known and respected figure within the Miaphysite world. How did his appointment as Patriarch come about?
Well, his appointment in 512 was significantly influenced by, you guessed it, imperial support.
Right.
It followed a local synod in Laodicea, which is backed by Emperor Anastasius, and this synod actually resulted in the deposition of the previous patriarch, Flavian II, who was Chalcedonian. So this opened the door for a Miaphysite leader to take over, and on November 6, 512, Severus was consecrated as patriarch by key non-Chalcedonian bishops. This included the very influential Philoxenus of Mabug.
And with that, he became the head of what would become the Syriac Orthodox Church. What a responsibility. What were his main priorities as patriarch?
His primary focus was on unifying the anti-Chalcedonian believers and defending the one-nature Christology that was championed by St. Cyril of Alexandria. Now, what's interesting here is that Severus, he actually took a moderate stance within the Miaphysite movement. He rejected both the Chalcedonian two-natures Christology, but also the more extreme forms of monophysitism.
So he was navigating a very tricky middle ground there.
Exactly. And this balanced position earned him admiration for his learning and his piety, but he also faced criticism from both sides, from the Chalcedonians, of course, but also from the more radical Miaphysites who thought he wasn't going far enough.
It sounds like he was walking a very fine line, trying to hold together this diverse group.
Absolutely. It was a very delicate balance, and he was very active as patriarch. He preached regularly. His cathedral homilies became very important for spreading his theological views.
Okay.
He was very involved in pastoral work, and he had this huge network of correspondence, all aimed at strengthening the Miaphysite position within Syria.
So let's dive a little deeper into his actual theological stance, especially his opposition to the Chalcedonian understanding and his championing of Miaphysite theology. What were the core arguments that he was making?
Well, at the heart of it was his conviction that the Chalcedonian Christology, with its emphasis on Christ existing in two natures after the Incarnation, that this risked dividing Christ. He saw this language as being dangerously close to Nestorianism, which emphasized this separation between the divine and human aspects of Christ.
Right.
Severus was a staunch advocate for the Miaphysite doctrine, the idea of Miaphysics, which means one nature. He was following the teachings of St. Cyril of Alexandria.
Okay.
And for Severus, the formula, one nature of the Word of God incarnate, was the only way to truly safeguard the complete unity of Christ. He believed that in the single person of Jesus Christ, divinity and humanity are united in a single, inseparable nature after the Incarnation.
So it wasn't about denying the reality of Christ's humanity, but about emphasizing the completeness of that union with his divinity.
Precisely. He wasn't denying Christ's humanity at all. His opposition to Chalcedon was about what he saw as this dualistic language that could potentially lead to a division within Christ himself. He really stressed the inseparable unity of the divine and human in the incarnate Word. And to support his arguments, he was incredibly rigorous in his use of early church writings, what we call the patristic sources. His massive work, Contra Grammaticum, is a prime example.
Right.
This work has like 12,250 citations from earlier church fathers.
It's an amazing amount of research.
It really is.
Yeah.
It was all to demonstrate that the one nature formula had deep roots in the Christian tradition. And it's important to remember that his Miaphysitism was moderate. He condemned Eutychianism, that more extreme form of monophysitism that sort of blurred the reality of Christ's humanity. In his letters to Sergius, he argued against any notion that Christ's human nature was somehow absorbed by his divine nature.
So he was basically fighting a battle on two fronts. On the one hand, against the Chalcedonian views, and on the other hand, against those more extreme Miaphysite views.
Exactly. He was very much in the middle, trying to chart a clear path. And he also debated with Julian of Halicarnassus, another Miaphysite theologian who had this idea of athertodicetism, the belief that Christ's body was incorruptible from the moment of his conception.
Interesting.
Severus completely disagreed with this. He argued that Christ had a truly passible human nature, meaning he was capable of suffering and death for our salvation. So through these debates and through how clearly he articulated his own position, Severus really helped define the core of Miaphysite theology, distinguishing it from both the Chalcedonians and the more extreme Monophysites.
It seems that his writings would have been so important in really cementing those theological boundaries.
Oh, absolutely.
What are some of his key works that we still have today?
Severus was an incredibly prolific writer.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He wrote originally in Greek, but most of his writings survive only in Syriac translation, largely because of later bans on his work by the Byzantine Empire. But some of his most important works, well, there's the Philaletes. It's a very detailed Christological treatise. It dates back to somewhere between 509 and 511.
Okay.
And in it, he's really laying out his defense of Miaphysite doctrine, very closely following Cyril of Alexandria.
So he saw himself as a follower and interpreter of Cyril's theology.
Absolutely. And then there's Contra Impium Grammaticum. The title means Against the Impious Grammarian. It's a massive work directed against John the Grammarian of Caesarea, a leading Chalcedonian scholar. And in this work, Severus meticulously refutes the Chalcedonian arguments. And he does it by using a huge number of citations from the Church Fathers, like we mentioned earlier.
Right.
It's a real tour de force of early church scholarship, showing the depth of his learning and the roots of his thinking.
It must have been a very persuasive piece of writing.
Oh, incredibly so.
Yeah.
Then we have the Orationes ad Nephalium, which are discourses addressed to Nephalius. These are two important texts written in response to a former Miaphysite named Nephalius, who actually switched sides and became a Chalcedonian. So in these discourses, Severus is really defending the Miaphysite interpretation of the Church Fathers and arguing directly against Nephalius. And his letters to Sergius are also very important. They deal with the extreme views of Eutyches, and they clearly affirm the full reality of Christ's humanity within Severus's theological system.
It sounds like his personal correspondence was a big part of his work.
Yes, absolutely. He wrote a huge number of letters. It's estimated that he wrote somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 letters, although again, most of them only exist in Syriac translation. These letters covered all sorts of topics: detailed theological discussions, interpretations of Scripture, guidance for monastic communities, and even matters of church administration. He was offering pastoral leadership and theological direction through these letters to Miaphysite communities all across the East, even during his time in exile.
Right. And we should also mention his anti-Julianist writings, where he was addressing the idea of Christ's body being incorruptible and reaffirming Christ's truly human and therefore passible nature. And he also gave a lot of sermons, right?
Yes, we have a collection of 125 cathedral homilies from his time as Patriarch. These were essential for shaping the theological understanding of his people, often explaining key Miaphysite teachings through how he interpreted the Scriptures.
Wow.
And on top of all that, he also contributed to Syriac hymnography. There are liturgical hymns and prayers attributed to him, including that famous Marian prayer, Sub Tuum Presidium.
So he was a theologian, a preacher, a letter writer, a hymnographer. His work really touched every aspect of the church's life.
He was an incredibly influential figure, and it's really thanks to dedicated Syriac Orthodox scribes and scholars that so much of his work was preserved, even after his condemnation and the bans on his Greek writings.
Which brings us to that difficult period in his life, his exile. What led to him being exiled?
Unfortunately, his time as Patriarch came to an end because of a major change in the political landscape. In 518, Emperor Anastasius, who had been supportive of the Miaphysites, he died. His successor, Justin I, was staunchly Chalcedonian. This put Severus in a really difficult position. He was a prominent Miaphysite leader, so he faced increasing hostility from the new emperor and the pro-Chalcedonian faction of the church. He was eventually deposed and had to flee Antioch for his own safety.
Where did he go?
He fled to Egypt, which at that time was a stronghold of Miaphysite belief.
Okay.
He was welcomed by the clergy and the monks there,
Right.
and from 518 onwards, Egypt became his base, although he never stopped being seen as the leader of the Miaphysite movement. And even in exile, he actively worked against the imperial religious policies. He kept in touch with and supported underground Miaphysite communities through letters. I mean, the Coptic church in Egypt really revered him during this time. They even saw him as a kind of confessor, someone suffering for his beliefs.
It's amazing that even though he was in exile, stripped of his official position, his influence didn't diminish. It actually seems like it grew.
It really does. It speaks to his character, his resilience, and the power of his convictions. And there's this fascinating, almost secret side of this period. It involves Empress Theodora, the wife of Emperor Justinian I.
Okay.
She secretly sympathized with the Miaphysites, and she actually became a patron of Severus while he was in exile. And with her support, he was even able to go back to Constantinople for a time, between 535 and 536. A bishop with Miaphysite sympathies, Anthimus, had been appointed Patriarch of Constantinople. It's likely that Theodora was behind this. So Severus met with Anthimus, hoping maybe to find some common ground or to gain some acceptance for the Miaphysites in the capital. But this didn't last long.
Right.
In 536, Pope Agapetus I went to Constantinople and he condemned the Miaphysite leaders, including Anthimus and Severus. Anthimus was deposed, and Severus's teachings were officially condemned by an imperial edict. So, once again branded a heretic, Severus went back to Egypt to avoid arrest.
So he spent his final years in Egypt, still considered an outlaw, but revered by his followers.
Exactly. He was still seen as the true Patriarch of Antioch by the Miaphysites.
Right.
And he continued to write, to guide the faithful through his letters, right up until his death on February 8, 538. It's traditionally believed that he died in the town of Zois in the Nile Delta. He died peacefully after giving blessings to the monks who were with him. His death was a huge loss for the Oriental Orthodox community.
What a life. So looking back at his life, his work, what would you say is his lasting legacy, especially for the Syriac Orthodox Church?
His impact is huge, and it continues to this day. He's venerated as a saint. In the Syriac Orthodox Church, they often call him Severus the Great, or the Crown of the Syrians.
Wow.
His feast day is on February 8th, and he is considered, maybe more than anyone else, to be the person who provided the intellectual structure for Miaphysite theology. He's even been called the founder of monophysitism as a theological system. Although we have to remember that his was a moderate form of Miaphysitism, as we discussed. He and Philoxenus of Mabug are seen as the main authorities on Christology within the West Syriac tradition.
So his writings became the essential texts for understanding Christ from a Miaphysite perspective.
Absolutely. They were the go-to sources for generations of Syriac theologians. People like Jacob of Edessa, he was a major scholar in the 7th century. He edited and wrote commentaries on Severus's works.
Wow.
His letters, his homilies, especially in their Syriac translations, they played a vital role in shaping Syriac Christian literature and doctrine. And his unwavering example, his clear teachings, they inspired the Miaphysite Church to persevere through persecution.
His followers carried on his work after his death.
Yes, they did. Figures like Jacob Urdeus, in the years after Severus died, they organized an independent Miaphysite hierarchy. This became what's often called the Jacobite Church, which is the direct ancestor of today's Syriac Orthodox Church.
Amazing.
So Severus's leadership and his convictions were absolutely key to the establishment of the Syriac Orthodox Church as a distinct communion. He even had a liturgical impact. There are prayers and hymns that he wrote that are still used in the Syriac Orthodox liturgy. His name is remembered in their services.
His influence went beyond just the Syriac tradition.
Yes, it did. He's also very highly regarded in the Coptic Orthodox tradition because of his time in Egypt. In Coptic tradition, he's almost seen as a martyr because of his exile. And theologically, his defense of one incarnate nature of Christ is the very foundation of Oriental Orthodox Christology. His arguments have been revisited and discussed in dialogues between the Oriental Orthodox and both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic theologians.
It's fascinating how his work continues to have an impact even today.
Absolutely. And in modern scholarship, people are starting to really appreciate how sophisticated and nuanced Severus's theology is. They recognize that he's building on the thought of Cyril of Alexandria, and that he very carefully upholds both the full divinity and the full humanity of Christ in one person. And it's his balanced Christological vision that continues to define what the Syriac Orthodox Church believes today. His life really shows us how powerful one person's theological insights and convictions can be. He shaped the course of Christian history.
It really is incredible. His work on the unity of Christ, both in terms of doctrine and the life of the church, is still influential and important.
You can really see how Severus of Antioch played a crucial role in shaping the theology of the early church, especially for the Syriac Orthodox tradition. His commitment to his understanding of Christ, his writings, and his leadership during a time of persecution, they left a lasting mark, a mark that we can still see today.
This deep dive into Severus has given us a look at some of the complex debates that were happening in the early church. It highlights the importance of theology, the challenges of unity within the church, and the enduring legacy of those who hold on to their convictions. And before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone about the researcher behind this fascinating information.
Absolutely.
Again, all of the research for this deep dive and for this whole season has been done by Andre Mbarak. He's a teacher and a tour guide in Jerusalem who's passionate about teaching people about the Aramaic roots of the Christian faith. I highly recommend checking out his website, www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com.
It's an excellent resource.
It is.